o'clock. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining today. This is the Module 3 webinar for the new Virginia Alternate Assessment Program. My name is Sarah Susbury. I'm the Director of Student Assessment at the Virginia Department of Education, and very happy to have you with us today. And if Leah is there with the slides, we'll go ahead and get started and move to slide 1. All right, thanks, Leah. I just wanted to refresh your memory about this particular graphic. If you have attended our previous module for the new VAAP, this should look familiar to you. We're emphasizing the connection and the alignment that needs to occur between academic standards or among academic standards, instruction and assessment. And these should all be closely aligned and working together, and then also reinforcing one another to have a successful program. So we've hit a number of these aspects through our previous modules, and we'll be reinforcing some of that today as well. So today's webinar for Module 3, we really are looking at helping school staff prepare for the administration of the new assessment. And that first administration, of course, happens this coming spring of 22. And the topics that we're looking at for today will provide a test overview, so a brief summary of some of the information that's already been presented previously about VAAP. There will be a section about using the practice items to prepare for VAAP testing. So how you can use those most effectively with your students. And then we've got a review of VAAP resources that are available for you, a test preparation checklist, and then we'll be going through some frequently asked questions. And we'll also be receiving questions from you today through the question and answer feature on your Zoom control bar. We have had the Module 3 webinar be presented to Division Directors of Testing. That was last week. That had a little bit different focus to it. So the session that you're in today is primarily designed for special education directors, teachers, and any other school staff that may be involved with VAAP. So again, we'll be hitting the topics that I referenced previously. And then there is one additional presentation tomorrow. So if you have colleagues that need to join, please pass the word. During today's session, we're asking that you please hold your questions until the end of the session. We're going to be presenting a fair amount of information today, and we think that it will answer some of your questions as we're going through the session. So if you could hold off on submitting your questions, they may be answered during today's session. Also, we will be recording today's session, and one of the Module 3 webinars, recording of one of those will be posted on the Department of Education's website, so you'll have the opportunity to review that and also share it with your colleagues as needed. And then finally, given the number of people that we have participating in these sessions or attending these sessions, we are not able to send out certificates of participation. And at this time, I'm going to hand it over to Leah Mason so she can start out with the test overview.
Thank you, Sarah. Good morning, everyone. My name is Leah Mason. I am the Alternate Assessment Specialist in the Office of Student Assessment. And this morning, I'm just going to spend a brief moment, as Sarah mentioned, to give you a test overview, which is just briefly going to talk about some things that we've shared in our previous modules. For those of you who have been with us in our introductory module, Module 1 and Module 2, this information will be familiar to you. And for those of you who may not have had an opportunity to review those modules, this is just going to give you a snapshot of where we are thus far with the new VAAP test administration. So if you haven't had the chance to review and listen to those previous modules, I encourage you to do so. So let's get started. So the new VAAP test, of course, is going to consist of the reading, mathematics, and science, and it will be administered the for the first time in the spring of the 21-22 school year to students in grades 3 through 8 in high school. For the high school VAAP, school divisions will have the flexibility to determine how students participate in administering the reading, the mathematics, and the science across the grade levels of 9 through 12. And we ask that school divisions maintain those records locally to ensure that all 3 tests have been administered at least once during grades 9 through 12. For those of you who are familiar with our VAAP grades form, that was a form that was asked to be completed by school divisions in previous years to determine which content areas were going to be assessed in which grade levels, and that is no longer required anymore. We are just going to ask that you maintain how you're going to assess those 3 content areas through grades 9 through 12 locally. Also, so reading, math, and science, the test will consist of 35 operational items with 3 answer choices. Each test will have 30 operational items that are going to count towards the students, and then 5 field test items that are going to be tried out for future use in other administrations. These items are designed to provide the maximum flexibilities for students with significant cognitive disabilities to show what they have learned, also while maintaining test security. In the design of the test, the easier items are presented first and then followed by more challenging items for students to be able to maximize the access for the test. Tests are available online through the TestNav application and in the paper format. If your student needs to have a paper version of the test, it is not required that you complete the documentation of need paper assessment form for them to have access to the paper test. Some of you may be familiar with that on the SOL side. In order for students to have access to a paper version of the test, they must complete the documentation of need paper criteria form to have access. That will not be required here for the VAAP. So if the student needs a paper version of the test, they can have access to it. Most of the items will be read to the student through the text-to-speech functionality with the online presentation of the test, or an examiner may also read the items to the student. We are anticipating that most students will be tested individually using the testing conditions that were discussed in Module 2 that are available to all students. And those testing conditions are not required to be documented in the student's IEP, but there are individual accommodations that are determined by the student's IEP that must be documented in their IEP. Students can enter their responses to their test items either online, or their responses can be indicated to the examiner based on their communication modality. The state test window for the VAAP administration will open on February 28th, 2022, and it's going to close on June 24th, 2022. Your local division will set their own testing window within that state testing window. So they will communicate that to you when your local testing window opens. Also, so VAAP testing conditions, we went a little bit more in depth about VAAP testing conditions in Module 2. These testing conditions are going to be available for all students that are eligible to participate in the VAAP as they're needed. They provide flexibility in the environment in which the student is going to test. They're not going to be considered accommodations, so they are not required to be documented in the student's IEP. And they are grouped in 4 categories: timing and scheduling, presentation, response, and setting. These are the 4 categories, and you see the bulleted list of those testing conditions that are allowable for students that are participating in VAAP to have access to. Some of these are going to be familiar to you as they are present on the SOL side, but they operate in a different capacity for the new VAAP test. So we're calling them testing conditions, which allows them to allow all students in the VAAP to have access to these testing conditions. And more guidance about this will be, for the testing conditions, will be present in the VAAP test implementation manual. For the VAAP individual test accommodations, we only have 4. We also went into some more conversation about this in Module 2. We do expect that when you select and use these accommodations appropriately, the expectation is that these accommodations will either reduce or eliminate the effects of the student's disability without impacting their learning expectations, nor do we want these accommodations to provide an unfair advantage. The 4 accommodations include Braille, interpreting and transliteration, read aloud, and the alternate representation of response options. For the read aloud accommodation as it pertains to the new VAAP test, we've had a lot of questions on this, so we hope that we can provide some clarification for you. So overall, majority of the VAAP test items are going to be read aloud to the student just as a function of the test. And they'll be read either through the text-to-speech functionality in TestNav or through a human read aloud. But there are a small number of items that are not going to be read to the student. So for this read aloud accommodation, the small number of items are going to apply in the content area of reading, where they are not all read to students. There is an introductory text that the examiners will see that is read to the student that will specify that the student is to read all or part of the item. Now, the read aloud accommodation is expected to provide some additional support for students in which their disability impacts their ability to access text, as well as the accommodation is going to be appropriate for students who access content primarily through their auditory mode. So here's an example to just kind of clarify this a little bit of how and when you can expect to have a read aloud accommodation. So in the examiner's copy, and this will be present in the paper and the online version, the example I have, if you look on the upper left-hand side, is that here's an item. It's a reading item, and it happens to be grade 3. The directions to the examiner will say that here are 3 words. This is what you would read to the student. 3 words and a sentence for you to read. If you notice the information that's located in the parens, that is the information that is directed to the examiner. And it says to point to answer choices and pause for the student to read sentence independently. This is where the read aloud accommodation will come into play. So if this is a particular item in which the student is expected to read independently, and you know that your student will not be able to read the items independently, they will then need to have the read aloud accommodation documented in their IEP so that as you come across items where the student is expected to respond independently, the examiner will be able to read those items to the student. So if you look down the same at the lower right corner, you will see that the answer option's there. So it says in the paper format, he brings the flowers to his mother. What does he bring? And then he'll have the answer options. In the paper format, it will be expected that the student would read that stem, he brings the flowers to his mother independently. So again, if you're trying to determine when and where the read aloud accommodation comes into play, it's really going to be when you have to determine whether or not the student can actually read items independently. And this is where the practice items are very important, because when using those practice items, you should be able to determine how the student responds to those test items that require them to read them independently. And that is when you would use the read aloud accommodation. Outside of that, as we shared before, majority of the test items are going to be read to the student anyway as a function of the test. Also, the read aloud accommodation can be used online with text-to-speech disabled and the paper version of the test. The read aloud accommodation does provide a lot of flexibility in terms of the speed and the pace and the volume in which test items are read. We do expect that as the read aloud is provided to the student, that is read exactly as is written, that you're using a natural tone and manner. We don't want any inflection in your voice that will provide any hints or clues. And it's also very important that as you're providing this accommodation, that the examiner or the teacher understand what the test item is asking for to avoid any cluing to the student when reading test items, because you don't want them to be read in a specific way. The alternate representation of response options accommodation. This accommodation allows for the 3 answer options also to be represented in a different way in order for the students to respond. So we have 3 examples that we include. For example, answer choices can be made into choice cards. You can use physical objects for answer choices. We have the example of in terms of clocks or money that is used instructionally quite a bit. And for those of you that use the picture exchange communication system known as the PECS, that can also be available for answer choices. This accommodation is required to be documented in the student's IEP. And we also have additional information regarding this accommodation that will be present in the VAAP Test implementation manual. Now, the roles and the responsibilities, there are 4 very important people who are going to be part of this new process. The Division Director of Testing, who will provide the overall leadership within your school division for state assessments, including the training, the test security, and any communication between VDOE and Pearson and any staff within your division. Your Special Education Director, which we are leaning on to provide some instructional leadership for teachers, support the DDOT in any manner for students in terms of accommodations and IEPs and all manner of those things, and those that are eligible in terms of adhering to the guidelines for those students and communicating with parents. The school test coordinator, who's going to be responsible for the logistics and the providing the training at the building level, ensuring that examiners are training, managing all of the online and the logistics of the paper tests, and then any emergencies and troubleshooting that may need to occur during testing. And then there's the examiner, who will also provide and prepare the students for the testing and the test site and maintain all of the testing materials securely and administer the test to those who are eligible to participate. So who can be an examiner? Examiners are going to be selected by the STC or other school leadership, and they will be trained in the test administration and security of the new VAAP test. Those examiners that are selected must agree and sign and adhere to the test security agreement. We recommend that the examiners that are selected are licensed teachers and are familiar with the needs of students who are eligible to participate in the VAAP. And we also recommend that you use staff who are familiar with the testing accommodations as well as the testing conditions available to VAAP students. Other requirements will be that if you're selected as an examiner, that you participate in your local VAAP training that will be provided by your school division. That local training could include attending and viewing all of the modules that we've provided. The introductory module, module 1, 2, and module 3 will be available on the VAAP web page at the conclusion of all of the VAAP modules. Attend any examiner training that will be provided, and also signing the test security documents that are required for the administration of the test. And that concludes my section. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Sharon Seiler, who will now take you through using the practice items to prepare for VAAP testing.
Thank you so much, Leah, and good morning to everybody that's joined us. We're so glad that so many of you could participate and be with us this morning. As we shared earlier, the focus of this presentation is really about preparing, the preparation that needs to go into preparing your students, preparing yourselves to really administer the VAAP test later this school year. So the focus of my presentation, or my section of this presentation, is on the practice items, because the practice items really offer the best tool to prepare for the test. So I'm going to be talking about what the practice items are, where you can find the practice items, and then how you can use the practice items. And I'm going to be using three students, the profiles of three students that we've formally used in modules 1 and in module 2. So let's get started with what our practice items are. The practice items actually come with an examiner's copy, and they are available for teachers and students. And the purpose of these items is to really help you to become familiar, you and your students, to become familiar with the format of the VAAP test items and what that looks like in terms of the online test and the paper test. The online practice items are available in TestNav. And TestNav is the Pearson platform that we use for state testing. But to access those those online items, everything is available by going through the VDOE website and going to the VAAP page. And on the VAAP page, that's where you're going to find copies of the paper practice items, the examiner copies, and as well as access to the online items that are available in TestNav. And when it comes to our practice items, you're going to find that the practice items are available by grade level and by content area. And the next slide is going to give you a summary. And notice that this particular slide shows you the number of practice items for reading, math, and science across grade levels. And you'll notice on this slide that it's not a complete test, because the complete test is actually 35 items, but you do have enough practice items to really prepare yourselves and your students well. So let's go on to the next slide. So the first thing that you want to become familiar with is the examiner's copy. And you want to have, whenever you're working with your students on the practice items, whether you're presenting the online version to them or the paper version, you want to have your examiner copy of those test items with you. So the examiner copy really includes three things for each item. In the examiner's copy, you're going to see introductory text that is either going to be read to the student if you're administering the paper practice items, or it's going to be read through the text-to-speech function in TestNav if you are administering the online version. And that introductory text is really designed to help focus your student, and that is offered to the student before the student begins to respond to the item. And then in the examiner copy, after the introductory text, you're going to see the question or the statement, and then the three answer options. And also in that examiner's manual, right after the three answer options, you're going to see an area where you can record the student's answer choice. So the examiner copy is very important. And on this next slide, I'll show you exactly what that looks like. So on this slide, you're actually seeing three things. On the top, you're seeing the examiner copy, again, that you would use for the paper test and for the online practice items. So you use it for the paper practice items and the online practice items. And then on the bottom half of the screen, on your left, you'll see the same item as it will appear in the paper format. And then on your left, again, the same item, but how it will appear in the online format. So if we go back to the top to the examiner copy, and this is a third grade reading item. So the first thing that you see under item 4, it says, here are 3 pictures with words. That statement is your introductory text. And then it says to the examiner that you are to point to the answer choices. Okay, so you read the statement to the student, and then you point to the answer choices of cup, barn, or beach. And then the next statement says, I will read a sentence to you, follow along. And then you are again pointing as you read the statement to the student. At a beach, you can play, walk, and relax. So that is your introductory text. And then the next statement is the actual item statement. What is this sentence about? And then we have our answer choices of cup, barn, or beach. And you can see, if you look at the bottom half of the screen, the student, whether he or she has the paper format or the online format, is going to see the exact same thing. The sentence statement, at a beach, you can play, walk in, and relax. Then the statement, what is this sentence about? And then the 3 answer options. Okay, so this slide just gives you a quick snapshot of what you can expect to find in the examiner copy. Also what you could expect to see in a paper format of the item, and then an online format of a practice item. And again, this is a third grade reading item. So the examiner copies and the practice test items are all available on the VAAP page. And the VAAP page is a part of the VDOE website. And so everything that we have in terms, all of our resources are in the same place on the VAAP page. So you can see on this slide, when it comes to our practice items and the examiner copies, it's organized in a very succinct fashion. You'll see in the first column, all of the reading practice items are listed by grade level. Then the second column, all of the math practice items, again by grade level, and finally all of the science. So if you click on there, click on those PDF by grade levels, what you're going to get is the examiner copy, and then the paper student copy. So that's the paper version. So the next slide has what you see, and there is a button on the VAAP page that will take you to the practice items in TestNav. When you get to this page, you want to make sure that you click on VAAP, which is going to be, which is circled in red on this slide, to your far right. And then what's going to come up is the practice items by grade level and content area. So if you wanted the grade 5 mathematics, you would click that start button to the far right, and then all of the grade 5 mathematics practice items are going to come up for you. The important thing to keep in mind here is that all of these materials are accessed through the VAAP page on the VDOE website. So now that you know a little bit about practice items and where you can find them and what they look like, let's go to our next slide, which is about how to use the practice items. This is so important to use these items to really prepare your students. because as a teacher, they're going to help you determine how your student can participate in the new VAAP test. And because of the diversity of the students in your classrooms, their different needs, we really have to approach this on an individual student level. So your first step is to select the practice items for the grade and content area test that your student is going to be administered. So if your student is in grade 5, then you want to expose that student to prepare him for the grade 5 test to all of the practice items for grade 5 reading, math, and science. So your next step is to use the knowledge that you have about your student, about how that student performs in the classroom, how that student shows what he or she knows in the classroom, to really make a determination as to which of the formats is going to be preferable for your student. Based on what you know, you're making the decision whether the online test or the paper version of the test is the preferable delivery method for your student. Now, there are going to be some cases where you may have questions. And in those cases, you may actually need to administer to the student both the online version, let's say, of the reading test, and the paper version. But I believe in most cases, you're probably going to have a good sense of the format that is going to be best for your student. So once you've decided on the format, then the practice items and the format that you choose are going to help you determine how your student interacts with whichever format you've chosen. If you've chosen the online format, the practice items gives you the opportunity to see how your student responds to text to speech. Or if you've given the paper version, how your student responds to having you read the test items. The practice items are also going to help you get a window on how your student responds if they're taking the online practice items, how they respond to the other features and tools that are in TestNav. And then finally, these last couple of bullets here, you will also get a clue of the testing conditions and the accommodations that your student needs. And for testing conditions and accommodations, really what is happening in the classroom is going to give you the best window, and the student's performance on the practice items probably will likely just confirm what you already know in terms of the student's needs. And then finally, the practice items will give you some sense of the student's pace. And so we have developed guiding questions, and you can go to the next slide, Leah. We've developed guiding questions that you can use with the practice items if your student is going to take the paper test. And then we also have a set of guiding questions if your student is going to be taking the online version, the online practice items. So just to go through a few of these questions, you'll see how they're very similar, but they're also particular to the format of the test. So a couple of these guiding questions for the practice test. The first one, how does the student interact with test items presented in the paper format? And so if those 6 or 7 practice items are going to give you a good window on this particular question. Another question, where are you going to test your student? What test location? So you want to be thoughtful when you're administering the practice items to choose a location that you think would work for the actual test, because then you'll be able to know whether that location is going to be comfortable for your student, whether it's going to be free from distractions. The next question is going to be important for the practice paper test. How many items is your student able to do? How many answers, items can you present, and that the student will remain engaged and attentive to in one sitting? And then when it comes to recording your student's answers, does the student like to mark his answers in the student copy? Or does the student indicate his answer in some way? Maybe he's using an augmentative system or eye gaze or pointing, and which will require you as the examiner to record the student's response. But that's, of course, an important question that you'll want to know in preparing for the actual administration of the test. And then, how does your student respond to your reading the test items? Important question. And then finally, the issue of testing accommodations and testing conditions. Which test conditions are helpful to your student? And then what individual accommodations are helpful to your student? And of course, if there are accommodations that you see that your student is going to need, then this is going to give you the information that you need so that you can prepare to discuss that with the student's IEP team, since individual accommodations do have to be documented in the student's IEP. So let's go to the next set of guiding questions, which I said are very similar to the ones that I just went through. The only difference, of course, is they are focused on the online delivery of these practice items. So the first question, how does your student interact with test items on the computer? What type of response, what level of engagement do you see from your student? Next question that's a little bit different is down near the bottom. The middle of the slide. How does your student respond to text to speech? Which of the TextNav features helped your students? And as we know, TextNav has a number of tools and features like color contrast, magnification, and some others. Which of those are most helpful to your students? And again, those practice items are going to provide you with that information. And then the same questions in terms of the testing conditions that were helpful to your student in the practice items, and then the individual accommodations that would seem to be helpful to your students. So with this information and availability of the practice items, I now want to kind of apply all of this with the profiles of three students, Matthew, Corey, and Lucy. So if you've been with us for modules 1 and 2, we've used the same 3 students throughout. And what I want to go through now is the profile of these students. The 3 are very different in terms of their needs, but they're also different in terms of the grade levels and the test that they will be taking. And of course, that's going to let us know which practice items. But we're going to address those guiding questions for each of the students and then develop a testing plan. So let's start with Matthew. And Matthew is a 5th grade student. And Matthew does have some academic skills. He reads and writes some sight words. He's able to do basic math with some supports. He uses speech effectively, but attention and distractibilities, as well as fatigue, are issues for Matthew. He also has some emerging visual spatial understanding. So he's beginning to move in the direction of being able to know the difference between left and right and fitting numbers into spaces. So when it comes to testing Matthew and preparing him for the VAAP test, the practice items are very important for Matthew. So let's go to the next slide. So Matthew's teacher, of course, has had the opportunity to see Matthew's classwork and how he performs with classroom instruction. So she decides, based on that the preferable format for Matthew is going to be the online test. So with that in mind, she administers to him the online practice test for grade 5 reading, math, and science. Again, these are the tests that Matthew is going to have to take as a 5th grade student. So these 5th grade practice items are going to give some very important information. So she answers our online practice questions for Matthew. The first being, how does he interact with test items on the computer? And what the teacher notes is that Matthew enjoys the computer, working with the computer, but he does need frequent prompts to help him stay on task. And this is to be expected because we know that there are some distractibility issues. We saw that in Matthew's profile. When it comes to the test location for Matthew, the teacher administers the practice items in the classroom, but it works for Matthew in the classroom because she does it in the morning before other students are present. And this is a comfortable setting for Matthew. It's a familiar setting for him. And because the other students aren't there, it is free from any distractions. Okay. So when it comes to how many items that Matthew can answer in one sitting, he's able to do about 5 or 6 items per session. The teacher also notes when it comes to entering his answer choices that he does like to interact with the computer, and he's able to enter answer choices himself, but only for the first couple of items. She does note that he does become fatigued and then needs her to, he identifies his answer choices, but his teacher enters that information for him. So let's go to our next questions. How does he respond to text to speech in TestNav? Matthew seemed to respond very well, but the teacher noted that he did need to have sometimes the entire item repeated in TestNav, or either portions of the item, in which the TestNav features for text to speech really allowed the teacher to do that. And so again, that's very important information in terms of knowledge going forward to address Matthew's needs. In terms of other TestNav features, Matthew didn't need any of the other tools in TestNav, but she does note here that he seemed to perform better when the text to speech, the speed of it was set at its slowest pace. And you will see in TestNav that there are some options in terms of the speed that the computer reads the information to the student. So Matthew needed set at the slowest pace. And then finally, when it comes to test conditions for Matthew, Matthew in his classroom work, He uses math tiles and his talking calculator. And so those were available for the practice items that used him adding and subtracting and computation. But the teacher again noticed that Matthew really, for him to stay on task, she needed to offer him a verbal prompt. So she was saying throughout the practice items, administration of those items, let's keep working to keep him motivated and on task. And when it finally, when it comes to individual accommodations, Matthew didn't have a need for any individual test accommodations. So the IEP team is not going to need to convene for Matthew because, again, keep in mind, test conditions are available to all students and don't have to be documented or not required to be documented in the student's IEP. So with all of this information, the teacher summarizes it in a test plan for Matthew. So she knows in terms of location that the classroom is going to work for Matthew. She knows that he's going to need multiple test sessions. And because he has to take 3 VAAP tests as a 5th grader reading, math, and science, that it's going to take several test sessions for him to complete all of his testing across those 3 content areas. She also puts on this testing plan other information that she's discovered that from his interaction with the practice items, that time of day that she chose for him arriving, since he does come about 30 minutes before other students, that is going to be a good time for Matthew to test. So that's when she's planning to offer him the test. And she decides with Matthew that she's going to use for his reading test that long testing window. So she's going to give him his reading test in March. She's going to give the mathematics test in April, and then Matthew's science test in May. And again, Matthew has, as a 5th grader, he has all 3 tests. So she decides to spread them out in the testing window. And she's going to test on Tuesday and Wednesday mornings from 8 to 8:30 before the other students come. In terms of the test delivery, she's confirmed through his performance on the practice items that the online test will work for Matthew, but she's going to have to set the text to speech in TestNav at the slowest pace, that items are going to have to be repeated using text to speech, and that she's going to really, the examiner, she's going to have to pay close attention when Matthew shows signs of being fatigued, so that she can take over for him and enter answer options. And I'll say here that this is a reason, because she is entering the answer options, that we recommend that she document it in the examiner copy in the area where you can record the student's response. Even though she's entering it in TestNav, that examiner copy, that written copy of his responses, is really a verification of that information. Testing conditions. The teacher knows the math tiles are going to have to be available to him. His talking calculator needs to be on hand for his math test, that she's going to have to offer those verbal prompts throughout testing to keep him on task. And then the last 2 bullets on this plan are really important, because Matthew's going to be testing over several sessions. The teacher really needs to communicate that to the school testing coordinator in her building, so that the STC knows well in advance and arrangements can be made regarding starting and stopping Matthew's test across several sessions. There's also a need to communicate with the building level administration what she's gleaned from Matthew's performance on the practice items, because it's going to be in the morning. Additional personnel may be needed to help start to get other students off the bus, because this was a task that the teacher normally did. And of course, if she's not going to be available for that because she's going to be testing Matthew. So she lets her building principal know to be alerted that additional personnel may be needed to assign to help the students in her class get off the bus. Okay, so that's Matthew. And the practice tests have really allowed for some very specific preparation around Matthew's needs. So let's go quickly now to Corey. Corey is a 7th grade student. And when we look at Corey's profile, we see that he is has very different needs than Matthew. In Corey's case, pictures and picture symbols are really the focus for Corey. He does have some sight word vocabulary, but it's limited to about 35 words. One of Corey's strengths, though, however, is that he can answer basic recall questions about short reading passages. When he speaks, he has poor articulation and he speaks in a couple of word phrases. And then another issue with Corey is that he does exhibit repetitive behaviors. But when it comes to the computer, he is able to use a computer and he's able to use the mouse, and when he's provided with a prompt, he can actually type. So to prepare Corey. So let's go to the next slide. So again, looking at Corey's classroom work, and the teacher knows in Corey's case, because he's a 7th grader, he's going to be taking grade 7 reading and grade 7 mathematics. So we start with the reading, and she decides that the online format is going to be the preferable format because, again, this is one of Corey's strengths. The online format for the practice items is where the teacher is going to start with him. So she gives him the online practice items for grade 7 reading. And in going through the questions for him, in terms of how he interacts with the practice items on the computer, he's very engaged, as we would expect, because Corey does use the computer in his classroom instruction. In terms of where he's tested and finding a comfortable place for him, the teacher really had to find a separate room for Corey where he was comfortable and free of distractions. So she decides to seek out a separate testing location for that, for the practice items. Let's go to the next slide. So when it comes to the number of items that he can do, Corey can answer quite a few items in each session. He's able to do 7 to 8 items per session, but he does need breaks. He does need some built-in breaks because Corey, and you'll see a little bit later, he does use a visual schedule in the classroom. So that's something that the teacher, and the use of the visual schedule and a timer and breaks is something that she's considering that Corey's probably going to need, and that she sees from the practice items that he's likely to need in the actual testing environment in the spring. And the next question, can he enter his answer choices independently? And Corey is able to do that on TestNav. and he demonstrates that in these practice items. Let's go to the next. In terms of text to speech, he responds well to text to speech and other features in TestNav. Corey really doesn't need, but the text to speech is available for all of the items, and that's very helpful to Corey. And our next slides, in terms of the testing accommodations and the testing conditions. The testing conditions really confirm for the teacher that what she's seen in the classroom really needs to be translated into his testing environment. So he is going to benefit from having verbal prompts, breaks, the multiple test sessions. And here we see, she's also incorporating that visual schedule with the timer. And regarding testing accommodations, Corey really doesn't need testing accommodations. His needs can be met through the testing conditions. So because he doesn't need test accommodations, his IEP team does not need to meet. So that's Corey for reading. But as a 7th grader, he's also going to be taking the math test. And because what she sees in his classroom work, she decides that the paper format is probably the best format for the math test. So she administers the paper practice items for math. And what she finds in terms of his interaction with the paper items is that he actually does quite well, but the use of the timer and the visual schedule were very helpful. Again, just like we found in reading, Corey does need that separate room for testing. Corey is able to do quite a few math items, actually more than he did in reading. He's able to do 8 to 9 per setting, but again, does need the built-in breaks that are aligned with the timer and the visual schedule. In terms of how he indicates his answer options, Corey marks his answers in the student copy of the test, and then his teacher is going to have to record his those answers in the examiner copy of the practice for the practice test. And if he were actually doing the actual administration of the whole test, then she's would have to go a step further and have those answer options that Corey's given taken from the examiner copy and actually entered into the TestNav system. But for now, at least she knows that the way Corey responds best for math is to mark his answers in his student copy. And so a couple of other things we know about Corey, that he does respond well to having the items read to him. So that works well for Corey. And in terms of the testing conditions for the practice items for math, verbal prompts that we talked about, the breaks, the multiple test sessions, just like reading, the visual schedule and the timer. But one additional thing is helpful for Corey, and that is for the teacher to highlight on the paper test the math symbols, the plus, the minuses, the equal signs. Those really help to focus Corey's attention on what he is supposed to do in the computation items. And then when, again, as we've said, Corey doesn't need any individual accommodations. So this is what Corey's testing plan looks like. And this, we can go to the next slide. That Corey is going to need a separate room, and the teacher's considering maybe the speech teacher's office as a possible option. He is going to need multiple sessions. She's estimating about 3 sessions per content area. So he's going to also need 6 sessions. And the sessions are going to have to be pretty long because she's going to have to build in breaks that go along that are aligned with his visual schedule. In terms of the day and time for testing, the teacher decides that Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday during Corey's elective class time is going to be ideal for reading. Corey is a middle school student, and built into his schedule is an elective class. So she's going to use that 1 week for the reading test, and then the same days of the week on the following week for Corey's math test. In terms of test delivery, Corey's going to have both reading, both the online and the paper test. Reading is going to be online, and math is going to be on paper, again, because it gives her the ability to highlight those math symbols for him. Testing conditions we've talked about already, but those are a part of the plan. But this information that's been gleaned in this plan needs to be communicated with the school test coordinator. So, because she's going to have access to the test so that she can go through it to highlight the math symbols. And that access has to be gotten through the school test coordinator. So she's going to have to make to let that information be known. She also wants to share that Corey's going to be tested on multiple days during his elective classes over a 2-week period. Important information, not just for the school test coordinator, but also for the administration in the school. Because he's going to be taken out of a class, Corey will need to have excused absences during those class periods. And the teacher may also need coverage in the classroom for students in the class who are not scheduled to take their electives while Corey is being tested. So some additional coverage is going to be needed because the teachers for students who are left in the classroom. And our final student this morning is Lucy. And again, Lucy, very different from Matthew and Corey. Lucy, in terms of her profile, if you look at this slide, you'll see that Lucy has a lot more physical needs than the other 2 students. She is in she uses a wheelchair. She has some issues with range of motion and mobility with her right hand. She's able to use that to manipulate large items and use her left hand to stabilize. There's also some issues with communication. She has a very, very limited speech, more so than the other students that we've been talking about. She only uses 5 to 10 words, single words. She has a yes/no response, but her primary mode of communication is through an augmentative device. And that's what she uses to communicate basic needs and choices. And they're also trying to incorporate a picture system for Lucy as a low-tech backup. So we have some motoric needs for Lucy. We have some communication needs for Lucy, but you'll also see there are also some vision needs that Lucy has because her vision is only partially corrected with glasses. There are also some hearing losses that require Lucy to have hearing aids. And then finally, there is a seizure disorder that Lucy also presents within her student profile. So again, the practice items, when we have a student like Lucy, really gives the opportunity to make some decisions about what can be done, how Lucy's needs can be met, so that she can demonstrate what she knows. So let's go to the next slide. The teacher decides for Lucy that the maximum flexibility can be offered to Lucy using the paper format. And so she decides to administer the paper practice items. And the content area assessment that Lucy's going to be given is science, because Lucy is a high school student and her school division has spread the content area tests across grades 9 through 11. And so, 9 through 12. And the only test that Lucy has to take for this year is going to be science. So the teacher is presenting the practice science items. So how does Lucy interact with the practice science items presented in the paper format? And this is a content area that Lucy really enjoyed in the classroom. So it was no surprise that she was excited about taking the science practice items, and she responded well to the items with the supports that are listed here. Lucy was tested in terms of the setting. The teacher decided that the classroom where her special furniture and special equipment would be readily available would be the best place to test Lucy. So that's where she offers Lucy and presents those science practice items. It was a comfortable setting for Lucy, and she was able to really focus on those science items. So let's go to the next slide to see what else the teacher learned. When it comes to the pace and how many items Lucy could do in one setting, the teacher found that it took approximately 8 minutes when you looked at each item, because each item, and Lucy is a student that we're going to see a little bit later that uses the alternate representation of response option. And she's actually using choice cards that have to be set up for each item. So between the setup of the item and Lucy having sufficient time available to make her answer selections, the teacher determines and estimates that Lucy's only going to probably be able to do about five items per setting. In terms of how her answer responses are recorded, Lucy, because she uses an augmentative switch, she indicates her answer selections using her switch with the choice cards, and then the examiner records her responses in the examiner copy of the science practice items, the high school practice items. So it's the student using the switch, it's the items presented by choice cards, and the examiner recording in the examiner copy. So let's go to the next slide for Lucy. In terms of reading the items, the practice items, Lucy is able to follow along with the reading, but the teacher has to make sure that she's wearing her hearing aids and that the FM system is set up, because again, we know from her profile that there are some auditory issues. In terms of test conditions, for Lucy is actually going to have to use several test conditions. The slant board or the special furniture is a condition, because there are visual issues. And even though the items are cut into choice cards, those choice cards have to be magnified for Lucy 130%. Because there are auditory issues, she's going to need the amplification of the FM system. And because it takes quite a bit of time to set up, Lucy's also going to have multiple sessions, and she's also going to have access to her switch. So testing conditions are very important for Lucy. And then finally, we see, and we've kind of alluded to it as we've talked about Lucy. If we could go to the next slide, we'll see that in terms of individual accommodations that are going to be helpful for Lucy. Unlike the other two students who didn't need individual testing accommodations, but Lucy really does to access the test. Her teacher has to enlarge the test questions and the answer options. She wants to cut them apart. She found that she had to cut them apart and position them just so that Lucy could see the question or the STEM, and then the answer choices. After reading the introductory text and the question and answer options, then Lucy had to indicate her choice by operating her switch with her right hand. And so there was a very specific process in terms of this accommodation for Lucy, so that the teacher decides to really take pretty careful notes and list each of the steps in the process, because she knows that because this accommodation, the alternate representation of response option, is going to be needed for Lucy, that she's going to have to go to the students, to Lucy's IEP team. So she really wants to be able to share in a very detailed manner how this this accommodation is going to be used for Lucy, and to answer any questions that might come up from Lucy's IEP team. So all of this information for Lucy, she's able to prepare a testing plan for Lucy. So let's just look at that real quickly here. And all of this, of course, comes from the Lucy's response to the paper practice items and those guiding questions. Lucy is going to be tested in the classroom in terms of number of sessions to do a 35-item test, and Lucy only being able to do about 5 items per session because of the setup time and Lucy's response time. She's going to need about 7 sessions to complete her science test. In terms of the day and time of testing, Lucy's parents are very involved and cooperative, and they offer to pick Lucy up instead of her riding the bus home for her, so that Lucy can take her science test after school. So the teacher, the examiner, and the parents agreed that after school testing on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday for 2.5 weeks is going to be a good estimation of a schedule that's going to be workable for Lucy. In terms of testing format, the paper test, which we've already talked about, as well as the testing conditions, the slant board, there are quite a few here, the magnification of the test items, amplification using the FN system, multiple sessions, 7 test sessions, and Lucy's switch. And then we've already talked about the alternate representation of response option. But again, this is where these last 2 bullets become so important, to have this information about the student up front, because this needs to be communicated to the school testing coordinator. The teacher is going to need advanced access to Lucy's science test so that she can do the enlarging, so that she can prepare the choice cards for Lucy. So the STC needs to know that Lucy has this accommodation because she's able to give advanced access to the test. And for this particular accommodation, the teacher can have 4 days prior to the administration of the test to prepare for Lucy. The teacher also needs to communicate with the school administration, because after sharing the testing plans for Lucy, the principal and the STC decide that a proctor is going to be needed for all test sessions. Now, having a proctor is not something that VDOE requires, but it is permissible. And so in this particular case, the principal and the STC decide that a proctor is really needed across these sessions. And the principal, with this information, agrees to talk to the vision teacher about serving as the proctor for Lucy. So as we can see, with the use of the practice items across all 3 of our students, information is gleaned to prepare the student for testing, but information is also gleaned that needs to be shared at the building level so that preparations can be made for additional personnel or support or access to the test. So thank you very much. And I'm going to turn things over now to my colleague, Lisa DePold, and she's going to talk about new VAAP resources and a VAAP checklist.
Thanks, Sharon. Yes, I'm Lisa DePold. I'm Special Education Assessment Specialist working in test administration for the Virginia Department of Education. Quickly, I'm just going to be showing you where to find all of these different resources that we have been highlighting throughout this presentation. So if we can go to the next slide. Here you'll see our VAAP, here you'll see our VDOE homepage as indicated in the upper left-hand portion of the slide. And if you'll just navigate to the VAAP page, which is indicated on the bottom right portion of the slide, you'll find all of our VAAP resources are collected in one spot for you. And on the next page, next few slides, we'll see what those resources are. As you are hopefully familiar at this point, we've had these webinars, training webinars to help you all out as you become familiar with the new VAAP. We are currently presenting Module 3 webinars, and once those Module 3 webinars are completed, then we will have that posted as well as the introductory webinar and Modules 1 and 2 webinars. So you'll have 4 different training resources there that can be used. In addition, the teacher FAQ document is there with frequently asked questions that may help you out. We also have our participation resources, which include the VAAP participation criteria and determination of significant cognitive disabilities document, as well as the VAAP participation criteria form. On this next slide, we outline for you the content of those first 3 training webinars. That can be very helpful to you if you have a specific question. You can see here what the content of those different webinars are. Each one has had a different focus as we've delved deeper and deeper into this new assessment format. And so hopefully if you can refer to these, that will help to answer your questions. And of course, if you haven't had a chance to attend these webinars, we do very much urge you to go back and kind of catch up and go through these presentations, these recordings that we have on the website for you. And the next slide gives you some further resources that are on our VDOE webpage. We have the document that provides all of the VSOL for you, those Virginia Centralized Standards of Learning. There is additional curricular resources which are available at ttaconline.org, which really dovetail with the VSOLs. And we hope you'll use both of those together. We also have assessment resources, as Sharon was highlighting for you. On our VAAP webpage, you'll be able to access the sample test items that give you a quick overview of the type of items, format, and content for reading, mathematics, and science. Those are mixed across all grade and content levels. So then to delve deeper into each grade and each content area, you'll want to use those practice item sets, which are divided for reading, mathematics, and science. Additionally, in the VAAP page, you'll find the test blueprints, as well as information on assessing history and writing during this 21-22 test administration year, since history and writing are not included in these VAAP assessments that we've been focusing on. Now I'd like to go over with you our VAAP preparation checklists. These should be able to help you in pulling together all the information that we've been reviewing in these webinars, particularly kind of the deep dive that Sharon just did in talking about Corey, Matthew, and Lucy, and talking about the assessment that needs to be done prior to the actual VAAP assessment so that you all can determine what will be needed for each of your students as they access the VAAP. So on this next slide, these checklists are provided for you to use. You may find that you want to pull them right from this webinar. You may find that you want to add to them. But quickly, you're going to make sure that you're familiar with all the information in those VAAP training modules that are on the web page. You're going to want to attend all local training events. If you're serving as an examiner, you'll need to attend the examiner training, as well as become familiar with all the examiner resources. Make sure you have those on hand, and be sure you've signed those required test security documents. Again, you'll want to become familiar with the curricular resources that are available on TTAC Online as you instruct your students in the VSOL. Again, you'll want to review those sample items to be sure you're familiar with the structure of the items and the features and tools that are available in TestNav, so that when you administer the practice items to your students, you're able to make that full assessment that Sharon described to make sure that you're making choices that will make the VAAP test as accessible as possible for your students so that they can demonstrate their knowledge. Moving on to the next slide. It's going to be important for you to discuss with your school test coordinator the test format that you've selected, the number of test sessions you anticipate, as well as the days and times that you'll be testing. You're going to want to be sure to arrange with the STC to have access to the test in advance. If you're going to need to prepare for specific accommodations such as interpretation or transliteration, or the alternate representation of response options. We also saw the example of a student who needed the test highlighted. So those are all cases where you're going to need to work with the STC to get access to the test prior to the test session. And you're going to need to want to talk to your school administrators about any coverage that will be needed for your classroom as you're serving as the examiner and working with a particular student. And on our final slide here, we're going to talk about making sure you have selected the ideal location for testing. You may find that an area in your classroom works for your student, or you may need to use a separate location within your school building. Be sure that that location is comfortable, free of distractions. And we also recommend as best practice that the student be positioned so that they cannot access any curricular information that may be placed around the room, so that they do not have clues to the answers for the tests. A very important process is going to be making sure you have all those manipulatives on hand that your student may need. Those manipulatives must be familiar to the student and have been used routinely in class instruction. You'll want to be sure that anything the student requires as far as a behavior system is also available, so that your student will be able to perform as well as possible during the assessment. At this point, Sarah Susbury is going to take us through some frequently asked questions.
Thanks, Leeson. I'm also going to put a message in the chat for everyone as we get kind of started to wrap up the last part of the presentation with some frequently asked questions. The link that I put in the chat is to an online form that is an evaluation and feedback form, and we really are very interested in your feedback about the modules, and then also any outstanding questions that you have that you would like to include on that form. So please use that link. We certainly read the information that you provide to us and appreciate any input and feedback that you have. So at this time, I'll go ahead and start with the first frequently asked question. If I provide instruction to the student, can I also serve as an examiner for the VAAP test? And it is permissible for teachers to serve as examiners for their own students. With that said, I want to be clear that it is the division director of testing or the school test coordinator, the STC, that will determine who serves in the role of an examiner. and also add just that examiners will be required to participate in the examiner training and sign the security documents related to proper test procedure, and then adhere to the examiner's instructions that are included in those examiners' copies of the tests. So there are some requirements that have to occur, but it is permissible for teachers to serve as examiners for their own students. And then a question that has become quite popular is, are proctors or is video or audio taping required for individual VAAP test administrations? And the answer to that is that the Department of Education is not requiring that the individual administration of the VAAP assessment be proctored by a teacher or a staff person, or that it be video or audio recorded. So that's not a requirement. We do, however, suggest that it's a best practice, but it really is a local decision as to whether that occurs. We know that that's a common question because of probably staffing concerns. So as I said, it's not a requirement, but understood that it may be a situation that it's helpful to have a proctor available, or maybe a situation that you want to have a recording of that test session. If a proctor is present in the room, it is important that they will sign the proctor's affidavit that is on that VAAP transmittal form. And I know we haven't talked about a transmittal form in this session, but it will be included in the examiner's manual, and we've talked about it with division directors of testing. Okay, and the next question, will examiners be required to remove curriculum materials from the VAAP testing environment? So we are not requiring that all of those curriculum materials in the classroom be covered or removed for VAAP in the VAAP testing environment. We know that the test window starts in February, and that would be an early timeframe to remove all of those materials from a classroom. It is important, however, that the student doesn't have direct visual access to those resources. So the student should be positioned when they're taking the VAAP assessment so that they're not viewing those curricular resources that may be on the wall. And then the other part of that is, we know that there may be other students in the vicinity. It's going to be important that test materials are not accessed either visually or audibly by those other students. A final comment here is that it is a best practice clearly to have the students be comfortable in their testing environment, and ideally be an environment that's familiar to them and free of distractions during testing. And then one of my students' parents has lots of questions about the new VAAP. Where should I direct them for more information? Well, the VAAP resource page on the Department of Education website is probably the best location to be able to direct somebody that's looking for more information about the VAAP assessment. And for parents specifically, we are working on some resources that will provide them a perspective. It will include a video and some additional information specifically for parents that will be coming. So that VAAP webpage is critical. And then if you're looking for more in-depth information, we would suggest that you refer the parents to the special education director or even the division director of testing for more specific questions about VAAP. And then the question has come up, if I have a student who is at the pre-academic level, how should I proceed if I don't think he can answer VAAP practice items? And I want to reinforce the concept or the idea that even though you feel that your students may not be able to answer the practice items, it's really important to give your students the opportunity to try those. When they are in an environment with their regular learning modes and their communication system, so that they can have access to this content, sometimes these students will exceed our expectations. So please don't make assumptions about what the students can or cannot do, and give them the opportunity to be exposed to this academic content. Okay, and then during the test administration, the question has come up about what happens if a student does not respond or cannot go any further. Can the examiner stop testing? And the short answer to the last part of that, can the examiner stop testing? The short answer is yes. That if the examiner determines that a student really can't go any further, is not making progress on the assessment, and that it's in the student's best interest to discontinue testing, that is an option that the examiner can use. I want to be clear about a few things that go with that. From an accountability perspective, so for federal accountability, for example, a student who completes at least 5 of the items is considered a participant. So that would figure into the accountability calculations. But it doesn't mean that every student has to complete 5 items. We understand that there may be a situation where that's not going to occur. So testing can be discontinued at any point in the test. I do want to include, however, that discontinuing the test will impact the student's score, as any of those items that are left unanswered are scored as incorrect. So there are some implications for stopping the test. Okay, and I know we're pretty close to the end of the session. Actually, it's 12:30, so we are right up against the ending time. I encourage you to please use that link that we sent out that's in the chat. I'll enter it one more time, and we'll leave this on here for another few minutes. But we are interested in your feedback. We're hoping that you've attended or will listen to the recordings of the other modules, and we will certainly be providing additional information regarding examiners that will come in the form of examiner manuals, and then additional information for directors of testing as well. So more information to come, and we appreciate you joining us this morning. Thank you very much for your participation, and we look forward to being in touch with you regarding more resources on that VAAP webpage. That's the spot where we really want you to use and rely on as a resource. Okay, and I don't see any other questions coming in. So again, thank you for your participation today. We'll go ahead and close the webinar. Again, that form will be available to you, so please grab a copy of that link if you're not able to open it directly, and paste that into your browser and provide us with any feedback. Thank you very much for doing that. And have a great afternoon and a great rest of your week. Thank you, everybody.